I want to thank Sean Reardon for inviting me to present work and contribute among this very excellent group. I have to say that many of you have seen some of the work I'm going to try to summarize, but I think the focal point here is to kind of provide an aerial view, kind of a tour of what the lessons have been of equal educational opportunity policy and connecting the past, present, future. And part of that, I think I'm paraphrasing something Bill Clinton said a while ago, where he said something like this: every problem we face as a nation has already been solved somewhere and at some point within the country. But what we must learn from the policy innovations that worked and expand those innovations, implemented solutions everywhere. And with regard to the achievement gap, that might seem like a stretch. But I do think that one of the things that Sean's kind of new data opportunity avail themselves is that we can learn better about what policies are working well and what are the kind of exemplars in the educational policy realm and what are the kind of causal determinants that can narrow these gaps. And one of the ways in which I'm going to kind of tackle that is by looking back to the kind of successes we've had in equal education opportunity via the first generation suite of equal education opportunity policies. And it's fitting that yesterday marked the 62nd anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And a big piece of what I'm going to at least summarize is the long-run impacts of school desegregation, and partly focusing on it because we want to think about impacts of policies that are transformational, that are not just the incremental kind of tinkering around the edges, marginal changes, but actually to look at the impacts of kind of sweeping changes in the way that our school systems functioned and the way that it narrowed significantly the disparities in access to dimensions of school quality. So school desegregation is one of the pieces I'm going to first focus on, looking both at the long-term impacts for cohorts that were born between 1945 and 1975, but importantly, following those cohorts all the way through 2013, but all of those cohorts are now in their 30s, 40s, 50s. They all have their own families and children. And so I'm going to be trying to at least summarize some of the evidence about how those impacts of the first kind of cohorts affected the actual next generation's outcomes, to kind of highlight the intergenerational returns to education policy. Now, a key piece of this in terms of thinking about the federal role is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 certainly put teeth in enforcement of school desegregation. And so I'm going to be kind of focusing on that piece initially. But there's other pieces that I think are important to think about. What are the other kind of major policy levers that have narrowed access to school resources? And certainly school finance reform has been a central part of that. State Supreme Courts ruled unconstitutional locally funded school state funding systems in 29 states, and that led to a significant narrowing of spending difference between rich and poor districts, and the timing and kind of design pieces of school finance reform, while very varied over the kind of 1972 through 2010 period, also give us a lens into how changes in the distribution of school resources matter. Okay. Thirdly, I'm going to kind of talk about, with time permitting, the impacts of early child educational investments in the form of Head Start targeted toward poor children. Again, there is important pieces of this where we can look at long-term impacts beyond the short-run test scores. And so that's initially what I'm going to be trying to do. I think one of the things that make going back in time particularly fruitful is that the 1960s and the civil rights era were really a miracle in policymaking, in the sense that we never had the kind of significant thrust of equal opportunity policies leveraged all at the same time. And so from the Economic Opportunity Act that included Head Start, that included the neighborhood health centers, that included, you have the Civil Rights Act of 64, 68, you have the Food Stamp Act, Medicare, Medicaid, Title I, our first kind of federal investments in poor districts at the federal level, and a whole host of others that won't even fit on the page, right? So one of the kind of identification challenges is that we then have to aim to separate the impacts of the kind of school-related reform issues from these broader set of civil rights era policies that were enacted in a similar time frame. So I'm going to be doing that partly by using the quasi-random variation in the timing of court-ordered school desegregation, but I'm also going to be doing it by actually compiling very detailed information about the timing of many of these actual coincident policies that happened in the same era. And one of the things that make that effort fruitful is that there are important compounding effects. Like typically our research approaches are aimed to isolate the effect of X, W, Z, independent of each other, right? But there are important ways in which the actual impacts had the long-term impacts that we see because of the, what I call the synergistic effects of the early investments that were in both education and health, that interacted both in the early investments and the later investments and made the later investments more productive. So partly it's that there's no one solution, there's no one attack, but it's the difference between a constellation of good policies versus a collaboration of good policies that I think is important to kind of understand the interconnectivity between health and educational interventions. Now, in the early era, this was in the form of hospital desegregation that improved infant health, that improved subsequent, what actually spilled over into improved cognition and cognitive outcomes within the school context. That was then augmented with the timing of court-ordered school desegregation, but it wasn't, and then we have the Head Start, which obviously is generally viewed as an educational intervention, but it actually is one that significantly expanded the access to early pediatric care in the preschool years. And again, healthy children are better learners. That's one of the missing links to school reform. So I'm going to be kind of trying to capture that kind of aerial view and try to bring us forward about what that means for today. Are we okay? Okay, I'm a pacer, so I have to move to feel like I'm actually engaging my mind. So I apologize if it's a distraction to some. The one thing you want to kind of recognize when we think about the civil rights era period and the kind of rollout and implementation of school desegregation is obviously it didn't happen all at once. And it's important to kind of characterize the deep concentration of poverty, particularly in the South. The 300 poorest counties, again, were targeted for a Head Start, and the fact that the 300 poorest counties are disproportionately in the South. We're talking about red areas representing more than 45% of households in those counties being poor. So much deeper concentration of poverty then than even today, and certainly African Americans were much more concentrated in the South during this period. But I present that only because it's important to contextualize where we started. Again, on the eve of the Brown decision, the pink represents where legal segregation is required. The green represents where legal segregation was permitted. The yellow where legal segregation was prohibited. And there's certainly a strong regional pattern, including DC, District of Columbia, having the legal segregation required. So it's really that the timing of school desegregation court orders that limited actual integration efforts happened without the court order. And so limited actual implementation happened in this first decade after Brown. Again, Walter Gilhorn, a legal scholar, described the pace of implementation in this first decade after Brown of one of an extraordinarily arthritic snail. And it's fitting because really there was such a resistance, right, that the Civil Rights Act of '64 really put the teeth in enforcement. And that's why the kind of thinking about the federal role in the context of this is important. Now, we're talking about 1,057 districts implemented court orders sometime between 1954 and 1985, and really we reach a peak integration levels in the late 80s. Okay? Now, what I'm just going to try to do so that you can kind of see this mapping of the timing of school desegregation, because it's going to be critical for my ability to kind of use that quasi-random variation to show and compare children that were actually raised in similar districts, the same district actually, but looking at across cohorts within districts, children who were exposed to desegregation for different amounts of years of their school age years. So one of the pieces of doing that is to recognize the rollout of implementation of actual school desegregation efforts. And what you could see in that quick mapping, because I'm going quickly since my time is short, is that you could definitely see that most of the action is happening between 64 and 70, so that by 1972, the South is actually more integrated than the rest of the country. And it's really this birth cohort variation, that cohorts born in the late 40s, early 50s, most black children went to completely segregated schools, and really by the early 70s, most black children were in districts where the lion's share, 90% of their school age years, were in some district that was under some kind of court-ordered desegregation plan. So it's those pieces where what I have in mind, right, is to look at look within districts, okay, and look at basically cohorts that were already 18 or older, called untreated or unexposed cohorts. They were already older than school age when the reform starts, okay? And then partially treated cohorts where the actual court order occurred sometime during their school age years, whether it be 4th, 5th grade. And so they're partially treated versus cohorts that were exposed throughout their school age years. And what I'm looking for is a dose response, namely that I'm expecting beneficial impacts, particularly for minorities, that is a function in part on the duration of exposure. Okay, but remember, there's kind of 3 major pathways through which I'm at least thinking about how school desegregation could affect outcomes. There's the pure effects that people generally focus on with regard to racial school segregation, but there's these non-racial aspects of integration in the way in which it significantly narrowed access to school resources. So increases in per pupil spending, reductions in class size that I'm going to show you in a moment. And so every district, the way in which desegregation affected school quality inputs was different, okay? Which means that I'm also looking for a kind of intensity of the dose. Not just the duration, but how much did it change school integration? How much did it change school resource equity? How much did it change parental, teacher, child expectations for child achievement? Because those are part of the mechanisms that I'm trying to kind of at least tie to some of these impacts. Are we good? Okay, so the main thing is we start from the full universe of all school districts for which there's a significant minority enrollment to just document what's been documented previously using a much smaller number of districts, okay? And what we see is leading up to the court order, there's no pre-existing time trend, but about a 25 percentage point drop in the black-white dissimilarity index. In 1968, that black-white dissimilarity index, which is the most commonly used segregation indice, represented about 75 to 80% of black children would have to move to a different school within the district for there to be racial balance. That 75 to 80% dropped by 25 percentage points when you compare cohorts that were exposed throughout their school age years relative to cohorts that were already 18 by the time it was actually implemented. So that's an important part of just about thinking about how it affected the level of school integration. But again, the effects on school spending is kind of a missed aspect of the kind of non-racial aspects of integration. That one of the things that happened as well is prior to integration, the district level resources were often disproportionately allocated to the majority white schools within the district. What school desegregation did was in part kind of level up resources to the level that whites were already getting via state-infused resources to districts that were undergoing integration efforts. And we're talking like about a $1,000 increase in per pupil spending during a time period where base levels of per pupil spending on average were roughly $3,000. So this is a 20 to 25 percentage point increase in spending that leverages up, that led to significant declines in class size for African Americans with no significant changes for whites, okay? Using data at the school level as well as the district level, using the timing of the quasi-random variation and these pieces. So the one thing is that was just to frame what was school desegregation. Now the whole point though is to think about long-term outcomes. So the first piece is linking 3 generations of adult outcomes, because what I have in mind is not just looking at the first generation that were born between 1945 and 1970, but to look at their children, the children of those children, okay, who've been born since 1980, okay? So the first thing I'm going to just document is this first generation, their outcomes, educational outcomes, adult socioeconomic status, earnings, adult health, incarceration outcomes, and I'm linking their residential address histories to the school district boundaries that prevailed in 1969, that prevailed when they were growing up, okay? And we're talking about 9,156 individuals. I'm not going to get into the weeds, just to give you a sense of what we find here, okay? So when you look at educational attainment, there's no real evidence of pre-existing time trend, but we see a significant increase in educational attainment. We're talking about roughly a year additional education for cohorts that were exposed throughout their school age years relative to cohorts that were 18 at the time of court-ordered school desegregation, and that those gains for blacks did not come at the expense of whites. We don't see any evidence that there are any kind of significant changes in effects related to exposure for whites. Now, all these models have a whole array of controls: school district fixed effects, region-specific time trends, coincident policies, from hospital desegregation to the timing of food stamps to Medicaid to, so those are all things in the background. But I'm saying to you first that there's significant evidence of increases in educational attainment, okay? We see that this is related, it translated to increases in high school graduation rates, increases in college attendance, increases in college completion, as well as college quality, okay? Now, those increases on the educational attainment front then translated to significant increases in adult wages. I'm going to be just showing you the results for adult poverty, because one of the key pieces about educational policy is we believe it has the power to break the cycle of poverty, to break the intergenerational cycle. So partly I'm emphasizing that piece because we saw that with regard to school desegregation, that we saw a 15 to 17 percentage point decline in the annual incidence of poverty for cohorts that were exposed throughout their school age years relative to cohorts that were exposed, that were not exposed, and a significant dose response with, again, no effects for whites. And importantly, over the longer term, that translated into significant improvements in their adult health status. So one of the ways which people kind of recognize the understanding of the determinants of health disparities is when you look at the achievement gap, you look at educational gaps, you look at socioeconomic status gaps, one of the key components of the convergence in the black-white attainment gaps is that this was the period in which that convergence happened most pronounced. And this certainly overlaps the school desegregation period, and I kind of identify that as one of the key drivers. But the adult health disparities, racial health disparities, also experiences this convergence in subsequent cohorts that overlap this desegregation period era. And part of the kind of ways in which socioeconomic status and access to schools can affect long-term health is via, this concentration of poverty and violence has also an exposure piece that is kind of how stress gets under the skin, that leads to increased allostatic load, that increases the kind of incidence of coronary heart disease, inflammatory disorders. These are not kind of processes that happen immediately. These are kind of sustained and cumulative that require the kind of data that has the long-term view. Okay? So what we see with regard to adult health status, again, using self-assessed health is, again, no significant changes for whites, but for blacks, basically what amounts to being roughly 7 years younger in adulthood for those that were exposed throughout their school age years relative to children that had more limited exposure to desegregation. Okay? So I say all of those things because what we also recognize is that the kind of school to prison pipeline can occur in close proximity to a school to life success pipeline. And so I wanted to also examine the effects on incarceration. And again, we see a significant drop in the likelihood of ever being incarcerated in adulthood for blacks with increased exposure to integrated schools. Again, part of this is to say we need to kind of think about, well, what's the mechanism? Traditionally, peer exposure is the kind of primary emphasis, okay, in this particular set of work. But I wanted to kind of re-examine ways in which is it the school resource equity piece that kind of accompanied these school desegregation efforts that driving some of this convergence in outcomes, or or improvements, particularly for African Americans, or is it the peer exposure that at least as one of the two prominent explanations? So one of the ways in which I at least try to provide some suggestive evidence is to contrast the experience of children in districts where desegregation was accompanied by a significant narrowing of school integration, or significant increase in school integration, but not so much changes in the school resource piece, versus communities in which it was both a combination of school integration with the school resource equity. And what we see is the kind of strongest convergence is happening with the school resource equity. That it's the school integration by itself doesn't appear to have the same kind of impacts in terms of thinking about these longer term outcomes. So what I'm going to try to do, just in the interest of time, is just try to kind of at least describe the kind of next generation outcomes, just so that you kind of have a sense of thinking about what the evidence says about how the next generation's outcomes were affected by their parents' access to better schools. Again, I'm looking at cohorts that were born since 1980, but basically I'm still comparing parents, but when they were children, whether they were exposed to integrated schools or whether they were actually kind of already 18 by the time that occurred, okay? And one of the things that you see on the next generation outcomes is, again, this is the likelihood that their children graduate from high school, okay? So I examined test scores, grade repetition, a number of things, but I'm just showing you the impacts for the likelihood of graduating from high school, again, as a function of whether the parent was exposed to desegregated schools when they were children, okay? Now, the mechanisms varied, so I'm not suggesting this is giving you a sense of the direct mechanism. The mechanism is a number of things, right? We saw improved educational attainment for the parents. We saw improved adult economic status. That also meant that in adulthood, they were able to select into neighborhoods that had higher quality schools, at least on per pupil spending, that they were in more integrated communities, they were in better neighborhoods, okay? And they had their own better parental resources. So there's a number of mechanisms, but what we see, okay, is that there was a significant increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school. We're talking like a 1.5 to 2 percentage point increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school with each additional year that parents were exposed to integrated schools as children. Now remember, the promise of Brown was to alter the socialization of children beginning at their earliest ages. So it wasn't just about kind of education, but it was about how access and exposure to diverse settings affects a whole host of outcomes that economists traditionally aren't really so much focused on, but certainly that we recognize that are important for developing the whole child in terms of how socioeconomic and diversity, kind of diverse exposure in childhood in particular affects prejudice, racial attitudes, and there's other work that has shown that indeed the kind of choice to live in more mixed, integrated environments, both in adulthood, is influenced by these earlier life exposures. So that's one of the key pieces that I just want to emphasize here. In the time that I have, though, I want to kind of bring this forward to today, which is about, that was then, there's a lot of dimensions about segregation and the way that it manifests itself that are quite different. Sean has certainly emphasized a lot of the kind of socioeconomic gradient and achievement gap in the way in which it's grown a lot since 1990. And partly that's also that even when we have most of the segregation now is between district rather than within district, okay? But even when we have kind of what ostensibly looks like desegregated schools, okay, if you do a closer dive into the actual detailed classroom and curricular offerings, we find that Black third grade children are 2 times less likely to be placed in gifted programs than their white and Asian counterparts. My colleague David Card has a number of work on that. But the point is that this tracking tends to reinforce pre-existing disadvantage with regard to curricular offerings that's not necessarily in line with the actual aptitude. So remember, achievement gap are much bigger than the ability gap, and that's what we have to kind of recognize, yes? So again, we've moved a lot away from this kind of desegregated environment, and half of those districts that were ever under court order have been released from those court orders. Sean is in prior work showed that that led to a significant increase in the actual amount of school desegregation, amount of racial school integration. I just want to give you a few stats and just show you a quick set of summary maps of this. So in terms of thinking about the resegregation of schools, from 1993 to 2001, which is really the period in which we've seen this major resegregation of schools, even through the present, right? The number of black students where 90% or more students are minorities, I call that hyper-apartheid, right, rose from 2.3 million to over 2.9 million. That I'm going to show you these maps that show the percent of black students attending schools in which more than 90% of students are minorities. The bar charts are going to show the number of black students attending a school with a given percent of minority students. Now, what you want to remember is by 1972, only 25% of black students in the South attended schools in which more than 90% of students were minorities, okay? In districts released from desegregation court orders between 1990 and 2000, that proportion had risen to 53% of black students now attend schools in which 90% or more of the students are minorities. So that's just an important piece. I'm going to just show you these maps to just show you this resegregation of schools. Again, 93, it's going to progressively move so that you can kind of see that map getting darker represents more segregation by race that is certainly very much interacted with the concentration of poverty. Okay, so what's important about this that represents school and education policy is that the residential segregation of families with school-age children is where most of the kind of increase in school segregation by class has occurred. Owens, Reardon, others have documented this. This is taken from Jargalski, but they're very comparable kind of assessments of that, which is very important to think about. I, in my own work, kind of show how the release of court orders, so on this side, these children are in successive cohorts that are exposed to integrated schools. You can see the increasing rate of high school graduation, okay? When the release of court orders occurs, we see a flatlining of that pattern of progress. Now, it's not clear what the mechanism is. There's a number of mechanisms that record to school resource equity and the like, but we don't see this pattern for whites, no kind of structural change and break in the relationship. Okay? The final thing in the time that I have, because we're really talking about the role of federal policy, and I've really been focusing on only one domain, really school desegregation. Okay? But Head Start and the interactive effects of early investments and the K through 12 investments are another important piece of why the K through 12 improvements in this era were so successful at narrowing gaps, okay? And one of the ways in which I'm doing this, okay, is by focusing on the rollout period of Head Start during the first 15 years of the program. So the first 15 years of the program, I document the kind of exogeneity of Head Start's timing of initial Head Start Center, as well as the kind of increases in spending over the first 15 years that are unrelated, at least within county, to changes in family and neighborhood background. So I'm using the initial kind of residential location address histories dating back to birth, okay? And I'm going to use the kind of changes in the geographic availability of Head Start programs, okay? This is an era where if you didn't have access to a Head Start program, the default reference category tended to disproportionately be staying at home, which is very different than thinking about Head Start spending in the counterfactual today, which typically ends up being another type of preschool program, okay? So the counterfactual here is a kind of home, okay? And what the first thing is to kind of document is the rollout. So this is the 300 poorest counties. Ludwig, Miller, others kind of focus on this 300 counties that received additional grant assistance to receive support for these grants. This is the timing of where a Head Start Center is over the first 15 years, which is going to be key to how I'm going to document these impacts. Okay, 65. Okay. So that's the rollout of Head Start in a snapshot. Okay. What I'm going to be doing is using the geographic variation in, you know, these are cohorts that were pre-cohorts, and then there's cohorts that were exposed, but they were exposed to different levels of Head Start spending, okay? And I'm going to be trying to then document how investments in early preschool affected later life outcomes, but importantly, kind of recognizing that the long-term efficacy of early child interventions are still contingent on the quality of K through 12 investments. And so in order to kind of do that, I want to look at the interactive effects of remember that Head Start spending kind of affects two margins. It affects how many young children you can enroll, and conditional on enrollment, it could affect the quality of provision. So the Head Start spending is capturing kind of something about both margins, okay? And one of the key pieces is that it's not just about educational outcomes. Remember, it's something that's affecting the access to health quality, that's affecting child health in addition, that's having these some subsequent spillover effects in the academic achievement years. Okay, you can see 98,000 eye defects treated just in the first 2 years. And remember, the kind of conversation we have about Head Start, it hasn't changed. If you go back to 1969, they were still talking about fade out, because the focus on test scores kind of sometimes can obstruct the view of other potentially important outcomes to consider alongside. I do think the test score pieces are important, but they don't capture the full dimensions and domains of kind of the capacity of learning and that are sometimes missed. So you see 900,000 dental, 740,000 without polio vaccinations, receive vaccines, 1 million given measles vaccinations. So this is a period where there's a lot of acute illness within children. And again, in the interest of time, one of the first things we show in terms of the annual incidence of adult poverty is that when we see these increases in spending of Head Start, okay, it would be not affirming the research design if the Head Start spending increased long-term outcomes at ages you weren't eligible. So there's a number of like placebo kind of falsification checks so that I'm looking at the kind of increases in Head Start spending, but examining for cohorts that are in the same county, does it matter if you were 6, 7, 8, or 9 when it occurred? Okay? I only find important effects on long-term outcomes if it occurred when you were age eligible, again, which affirms that there's something about the access to these services that are certainly improving long-term outcomes. In the interest of time, I will just end with this figure here to say that to demonstrate the kind of interconnectedness or interactive effects of early preschool spending and K through 12 spending, we use the school finance reform induced changes in spending in the K through 12 years as an instrument for spending, so that we can look at, this is basically the effect on the annual incidence of adult poverty in adulthood of a $1,000 increase in Head Start spending, okay, per poor 4-year-old in the county, followed by a 10% increase in spending during the K through 12 years. We see the combined effect of that type of intervention leading to a roughly 11 percentage point decline in the annual incidence of adult poverty. Okay, remember we said education policies can potentially have the power to break the cycle of poverty. We do see evidence of this, okay? Now, if we just focus on the K through 12 kind of investment, doing K through 12, 10% increase in spending at the average Head Start spending level, we still get a pretty sizable gap, roughly a 9 percentage point decline in the annual incidence of adult poverty, okay? But what I really want you to kind of zero in on is these top 3 rows, and I'll be done, represent a $1,000 increase in Head Start spending. The difference is whether the children subsequently attend a school district that's 10% below average K through 12 spending, a K through 12 district that's at the average K through 12 spending, and a district that's about 10% above average. Okay? And that's what I want you to kind of just see. Same Head Start spending, but we see that the long-term effects as it relates to reducing the annual incidence of poverty seems to be very much related to the subsequent K through 12 investment. So again, you can think about it the other way as well, that the K through 12 investments are enhanced by the early child education investments. So I need to stop. There's many things in closing that I want to say about the way forward. And one of the ways forward I think that's important to reconcile is that we focused on the resources. We have focused even on early childhood. We've even focused on some of the integration efforts. But I still think that without focusing on the suboptimal distribution of high-quality teachers, that we need to have a no teacher left behind. That's commensurate with the no child left behind emphasis. And that kind of value added of teacher quality to the learning needs to be a more central element of our assessing access to opportunity. And without that, I think that we're going to fail in the longer run. So thank you.